I'm dialing the director, Oliver Stone. Just give me a moment. Hello, Mr. Stone. Linda Green. How did I get through? Oh, well, I talked to your secretary. Well, we girls have to stick together. Why did I call you? Well, Robert Capra is not available, and I think you may be the best person to make the movie Mr. Kastenmeier Goes to Washington. I've only got 2 minutes. No problem. Okay, here's my pitch. Let me say first that we have to be careful about the timing of the release. We wouldn't want to go up against Beverly Hills, Chihuahua. Yes, I know. You're worried about that right now with your new movie about that president. Oh, I sympathize. It'll work out. Okay, here it is. Here it is. A young man born in a very small town in Wisconsin, Beaver Dam, goes to World War I in the Philippines as a private, comes out as a lieutenant, participates in the post-war rehabilitation of the Philippines, attends 2 great colleges, Carleton and the University of Wisconsin Law School. That's where the band comes in on Wisconsin. Practices law, becomes a justice of the peace, and the next thing you know, the people of Wisconsin send him to Congress. Yeah, that's the title. There, he fights enmity, inertia, and injustice. Yes, I know, Mr. Stone, it's not exactly the truth, justice, and the American way, but our audience will get it. Trust me on this. Congress is abuzz after he changes the name of Committee 3 to the House Judiciary Committee on Courts, Civil Liberties, and the Administration of Justice. And that's just the beginning. The handwriting is on the wall. He leads prison reform. He works to pass civil rights legislation in the 1960s. He supports the seating of the black members of the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party at the 1964 presidential convention. He helps spearhead the impeachment of President Nixon, and he tackles long-stalled, sorely needed reform in the area of intellectual property law. Well, Mr. Stone, we have to keep that in. This is very important to Mr. Kastenmeier and to this country. There's more. He serves the people of Wisconsin and this nation for 3 decades, and he is so gracious after his defeat by an upstart challenger 30 years his junior. Though no longer in Congress, his legacy lives on. His legacy is more than the sum of his legislative victories. So many go to Washington and return with nothing to show but bridges. You've got to go. You've got to go. Okay. Send you the treatment? Hey, will do. Hollywood. I better check with the History Channel or the Biography Channel. I had just one more thing to say. Mike Remington, son of our beloved Frank Remington, summed up Mr. Kastenmeier's legacy. Kastenmeier is a longtime believer in public service and in the good that can emanate from government. Mike also said he is also one of the most decent, considerate men you're going to run across. Mike, I'm going to work that into the script. Well, whatever happens with this movie, the nation and the state of Wisconsin are so lucky that Mr. Kastenmeier went to Washington. I give you the namesake of this lecture, Mr. Robert Kastenmeier.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I must say that those of you with the program and see Victoria Norse as doing the introductions, actually that was Linda Green who did it. And that's perhaps one reason I don't use a cell phone, but in any event. thank you very much, Linda. Dean Davis, I'd like to, at the outset, taking recognition that we have tremendous crowd. As Dean Davis observed, the largest I think we have ever had in this room for a lecture. And we've had a lot of lectures since really 1992, I guess was the first time. For 16 years we've had these lectures. I'd like to thank a number of people, not only Linda and other members of the faculty, particularly Fred Carstensen and his wife Carol, both worked on this very hard. I'd like to also say that Anuj, I don't know if Anuj is here. Yes, he is. Thank you for working on it. Anuj Desai of the faculty here at the law school. I'd like to thank Theresa Doherty and Lynn Thompson as well. Perhaps most of all, I'd like to thank for the terrific crowd someone who's worked on this from the very beginning, and that's Bill Kaplan. Bill. He more than anybody else. I'd also like to acknowledge that probably the father of the Kastenmeier Lecture is really Michael Remington. And Mike is with us, and he should be acknowledged. He started out in the beginning of 1992. I'd like to also acknowledge the fact that since I was once a justice of the peace and have a strong feeling for the judiciary, I'd like to acknowledge at least 3 members of the judiciary that are here. Came from Milwaukee, actually. Judge Clevert is here. Judge Edelman is here. He's standing up. Thank you, Judge. Judge Edelman is here from Milwaukee. There he is. And our former circuit judge, well known to everybody, I think, in Wisconsin virtually, Dick Cudahy is also here. Dick, he's down here. He and among the people that we know here, he and Tom Fairchild were among those who served in the circuit with such really great distinction for so many years. Well, I do want to get on to the pleasant duty I have of introduction. And I want to say at the outset that the timing of this lecture is, I think, very, very good. It is really a season of political decision. It's also a season of economic turmoil, not only in this country but globally, which suggests that politics and economics have something to do with one another. In that respect, as I say, our speaker and our subject are very timely. I must say that also point out that our speaker is an author of a book that was put out last year. I've seen a couple copies around here tonight, actually, this afternoon. It's a book that I commend to you. It's wonderfully written, somewhat like the author himself. It's somewhat timid in its assertions. But it's entitled, to give you a picture of it, it's entitled to Raising Hell for Justice. The Washington battles of the heartland progressive. And it is that, and it's more than that. More than that in the sense that it isn't just the battles that our speaker fought and is fighting, but it is a history of himself, really, and part of the state that he represented and represents so well. In it, he points out Dave actually was born in Oklahoma. Came to back with his family to Marathon County and to Wausau for most of the years he grew up, perhaps all the years he grew up. And as he even points out in his book, he was once a strong supporter of Joe McCarthy, but became somewhat disillusioned with him when he felt that the senator couldn't prove his assertions, and became a strong opponent. That was part of his early politics, but later, of course, he left Wausau, came here, the University of Wisconsin, and both he and his wife are, I'm pleased to say, graduates of this great institution. And I'd like to introduce his wife, Joan Obi, would you? It was here at a very early age that Dave got successful in politics. He ran for the assembly and served 4 terms in his 20s. He was 20 years old. In the state assembly from Wausau, he was part of the leadership with Bob Huber. Those 2 fellows were running the assembly for a while for the Democratic Party, for the Democratic caucus. And that's where I'm sure he honed up on his legislative skills, which he so desperately needed later in his career. From there, he went to Washington. He actually, as you know, at the age of 30, when elected, was the youngest member of the House of Representatives. He replaced an outstanding, actually, a very creditable Republican, Mel Laird, who was a leader in his own right, part of the Republican leadership in the House, and very well respected. But Mel had gone on, as you know, to the cabinet, and Dave came in and started his first term in what turned out to be nearly 40 years of service. It isn't so much the service that's significant. It is the quality of the service. That Dave was able to, in my view, become one of the 2 or 3 most important members of the House of Representatives. He started early, principally he's concerned about all issues, foreign policy included, but the economy and economics was his forte, and he served on the Budget Committee. He served twice as chairman of the Joint Economic Committee, and early on got on the Appropriations Committee, and in 1994 had to fight an elder, beat him, so to speak, to finally become the chairman of the Appropriations Committee. And that was because they simply recognized the quality of this legislator. In my view, then, you can maybe suggest that the Speaker is more important in the House, but I don't think any other member, possibly the Majority Leader, might be an equal, but in stature, in respect, in authority, legislative authority, no other person in the House of Representatives outranks Dave Obey. I'll go further and suggest that in terms of the history of Wisconsin, and Dave has now served longer than anyone in the history of the state of Wisconsin, there are probably, in terms of those people that we've elected to the Congress, Senate or House, there are only 2 other members that occur to me, the legendary Bob La Follette, and I think really, at least in my view, the legendary Gaylord Nelson. Dave stands in a rank with them. And when legislative history, when the political history of this state is written, it will be Dave Obey who will be a legend one day. It is therefore a great pleasure for me today to introduce someone who is a dear, close friend. The chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, the congressman from Wisconsin, Dave Obey. Dave?
Thank you. I had to pour a martini. Let me, first of all, thank Bob for that ridiculously fulsome introduction. It's clearly a case of mistaken identity. Let me apologize for my voice. Every fall when leaf mold hits, I get buried in it, so I'm having my usual troubles today. Let me also introduce someone. Since Bob introduced my wife, let me introduce his wife, Dorothy Kastenmeier. Also, Renee Daniels, my right-hand gal from my Wisconsin staff. And Justice Ann Bradley from the State Supreme Court. And Mark Bradley, the head of something called the Border Regents. I think I have misunderstood what I was supposed to talk about today. I was told that I was supposed to talk about how to restore civility to politics. And I was looking around for models. And I told this to people in Marshfield when we dedicated a new hospital, or a new clinic wing for our friend Mel Laird. I told them the same thing, that I searched high and low for a model that we could emulate in order to bring greater civility to American politics. And I finally settled on one, John Prescott, who a few years ago was the deputy to Tony Blair. And this is the way Prescott once described the opposition political party. He said, "They are the most desperate, despicable, seedy, grubby, hopeless, lying, hideously incompetent bunch of third-rate, double-dealing disasters this great nation has ever seen." So I thought, well, maybe the British system isn't the model after all. So I asked them if I could change the subject. They said, okay, why don't you explain why Wall Street's gone to hell in a handbasket? So I did, and as I told the group at Marshfield, I really discovered when this all started, when George Will, the conservative columnist, who is a good friend of mine, when George Will called me after the second Cubs loss in the playoffs. And Will said it was terrible. He said, I was at Wrigley Field for both games. And he said, in the last inning, when the crowd realized that the Cubs, again, were going to go another 100 years without winning the World Series, he said the crowd started chanting, "Bail out the Cubs, bail out the Cubs." And if you check the timetable, you will see that's when it all started. So I guess that's really not true, but it's more fun to think of it that way. The first time I ever heard the name Bob Kastenmeier was 50 years ago in October of 1958, when I attended my first meeting of the Young Democrats in a room in the Student Union. I was new on campus. I'd spent the first 2 years at the Marathon County branch campus. And I transferred here as a junior. And at the beginning of that junior year, I went to my first meeting. And as I sat there, I heard an older student, Pat Putsey, ask for volunteers to distribute literature for the Democratic candidate for governor, Gaylord Nelson. I had at that point never heard of Gaylord Nelson. All I knew is that Bill Proxmire was running for re-election to the U.S. Senate after being elected in a 57 special election to succeed Joe McCarthy. And I wanted to distribute literature for Prox. But Putzi explained that the way the ballot was constructed, that Nelson was at the top of the ticket, and the best way to help Proxmire was to help the top of the ticket by peddling literature. And he said he was confident Proxmire would win, but he wasn't sure about Gaylord, and we needed to focus on him. And then he said, and I really believe this young fellow, Bob Kastenmeier, has a shot at winning the 2nd congressional seat. Over the next weeks, we peddled literature for all 3 of them. And on the Monday evening before the election, I was passing out literature for the ticket on the Capitol Square. And as I went about my business, I noticed this good-looking woman a few feet away. And she finally walked over to me and she said, you know, we're hitting the same people. Don't you think it'd be good if we moved down the block? I replied, I'm sorry, lady, but all's fair in love, war, and politics. To which she replied, I know, but we're on the same side. I'm Dorothy Kastenmeier. So I felt like an idiot. And I skittled down to the end of the block. And the next day, all 3 men won. And I never met Bob, actually, until 2 years later. In 1960, he was running for re-election. I had just started grad school. Kazler Shiki and Ruth O'Malley were looking for volunteers to pass out literature while Bob shook hands at Kohl's grocery store on East Washington. And the first time I ever laid eyes on Bob, he was standing outside the door at Kohl's. We would hand out the customers literature. And as they went into the store, at the last possible moment, Bob would shyly stick out his hand and say, hi, I'm Bob Kastenmeier, almost in embarrassment. And when I saw that, first thing I thought was, geez, he's a good-looking guy. And the second thing I thought was, he's so shy, this guy really does need our help. And so he won, but I never imagined that day that within 10 years I would be a colleague of his in the House of Representatives. And I certainly never managed that I would wind up having as my 2 best friends in the Congress, Gaylord Nelson and Bob Kastenmeier. You can't do much better than that. Bob was a perfect fit for this district, and through the years, he pursued a career that made him one of the most significant federal legislators in Wisconsin history. In my book, which Bob talked about, I wrote this about Bob. Bob Kastenmeier and Henry Royce, incidentally, Henry's wife, Margie, died this week, in case some of you don't know. Bob Kastenmeier and Henry Royce were also deep into reform efforts in the House. Henry focused mostly on tax reform and urban development, Kastenmeier on Vietnam, civil liberties, and copyright law. In later years, Bob became the unquestioned and unrivaled congressional expert on intellectual property issues. He was ahead of his time in understanding the economic importance of copyright law in the high-tech age. In the 1990s, it amazed me that just when the Madison economy and the University of Wisconsin were moving into an era where technology often defined opportunity, they turned out of Congress the one person who could have given them a leg up in riding that economic revolution and creating thousands of jobs in the process, an incredible loss to Wisconsin's entire economy. But Bob's main focus was on Vietnam. There, too, he was ahead of his time, for instance, in holding the first teach-ins in the nation on Vietnam. And then I wrote, the legendary Phil Burton of California respected his reformist peers, but the only one he felt at all intimidated by was Kastenmeier. I think because Burton recognized in Kastenmeier a purity of purpose that gave him added moral weight. There is no doubt that today Bob is most saluted for his early leadership, along with Gaylord in his opposition to the war in Vietnam. And on the Judiciary Committee, he became, as you know, one of the leading experts on intellectual property law. Another notable and noticeable aspect of his career, which doesn't get as much notice as it should, was his work on the Interior Committee on Environmental and Natural Resources issues, working with people like Mo Udall and Phil Burton. He was, for instance, the lead House sponsor of the bill to create the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. His aggressive work and his leadership on civil rights is just as notable as Russ Feingold's is today, and his fierce efforts to provide aggressive congressional oversight of intelligence operations earned him the undying enmity of people like Dick Cheney. In a year when the first African American in our nation's history has a good chance to be elected president, it's especially fitting to note Bob's leadership in pursuing the cause of civil rights. He was not just there for the votes on civil rights. He felt it in his gut. He was passionate about it. But there's another theme that constantly ran through Bob's public service, which is not frankly often mentioned, but which I believe goes right to the core of what Bob Kastenmeier has been all about, and that is his commitment to economic justice. And that is why I want to talk, or that's what I want to talk about tonight, because that commitment was a lifelong characteristic of his congressional career, and because it is, as Bob said, the pivotal issue in this election. Now, I know some will say that Iraq is equally pivotal, but I would submit that those of us who opposed the war right from the start and have been insisting that we adopt a timetable for ending the war in Iraq have in reality already won the key point in the debate. Last year, the president vetoed my bill that tried to establish a reasonable goal, a timeline, if you will, for ending our involvement in that war. The president's allies in the Senate bottled up a second attempt to do the same thing. They said it would, quote, be irresponsible to establish a timeline goal. And when Barack Obama supported us, John McCain said that Obama would rather lose a war than lose an election. But now, the Bush administration is negotiating what they call a time horizon with the Iraqi government. Now, if you can tell me the difference between a time horizon and a timeline, you're a whole lot smarter than I am. That time horizon would have us have U.S. troops out of Iraqi cities by a specific date in 2009 and out of the country by 2011. That timeline, especially the first one, is obviously too long. But the very fact that the idea of a timeline has now, for all practical purposes, been accepted by the administration, and also, I might add, demanded by Prime Minister al-Maliki, is an admission that just plugging along is self-defeating. And that means that the most profound differences to be resolved in this campaign are those that will determine what our economic roadmap for the future should be. If Bob Kastenmeier were in the Congress today, he would be fighting and voting to return America's economic outlook to what it was when he was first elected. So what are the economic choices and the economic imperatives that we face? They are the same imperatives that faced this country in the decade Bob was growing up: to restore norms of decency to the distribution of economic rewards of this society, to create a sense of real rather than rhetorical equality of opportunity for every American, regardless of what station they were born into, and to restore confidence that the umpire is back on the field to protect consumers and investors from the excesses of the financial institutions that have put the prosperity and security of the entire nation at risk. Now, to understand what I mean, I think you need to understand just one set of numbers, because I think both parties have got the storyline wrong in terms of what is happening in the economy. I do not believe that this trouble started with housing, and I do not believe that this trouble started with Wall Street. I think it started with one very fundamental fact. And to explain what that fact is, I want to walk you through some history. When Bob was first elected, the most well-off 10% of American families in this country possessed about 33% of the nation's total income, and America had been the beneficiary of a 15-year boom that had remade America's middle class. 3 decades earlier, in 1929, the situation had been far different. When the economy collapsed in 1929, the wealthiest 10% of Americans possessed 50% of the nation's income. Arthur Schlesinger, the great historian, wrote that prosperity could not be sustained because the pattern of income distribution was so warped that average workers could not afford to consume the very products and services that they produced. The Roosevelt New Deal changed that by adopting a more progressive tax code, by enhancing workers' ability to negotiate at the bargaining table for a bigger share of the American pie, by making it easier for workers to unionize, by enacting programs such as Social Security and a number of other items, by raising the minimum wage, by enforcing laws limiting the hours workers could be required to work, and by establishing rules of the road for Wall Street and for corporate America. And as worker productivity increased, the economy expanded, and the lion's share of the benefits of that increased worker productivity ended up in the pockets of those same workers. So by the end of Bob's second decade in Congress, in 1980, workers' share of productivity increases had produced a golden age in this economy. In the 1920s, get this, in the 1920s, real workers' wages had declined by almost 10% at the same time that worker productivity had increased by 60%. So they got not one dime of benefit for their increased productivity. But from 1950 through 1980, worker productivity grew by 92%, and 90% of that wound up in workers' pockets. Over that time, the economy was sustained by healthy consumer purchasing power, and workers managed to save a significant share of their income. Since then, as you know, it's been a depressingly different story. Workers have been able to pocket only a tiny share of productivity gains, and inexorably the distribution of income across America has returned almost exactly to the 1929 pattern. Once again, aided and abetted by the financial sector of the economy that produced one get-rich scheme after another for those with easy access to capital, the most well-off 10% of the population are again raking in 50% of the nation's income, and the numbers since the turn of the new century have been especially obscene. Again, some numbers. From 2002 to 2006, the top 100th of 1% of the population, some very fortunate 15,000 families, have seen their income explode from an average of 15 million to an average of 29 million. The top 10% of American families during that 8-year period have taken in an astounding 95% of all of the income growth that has occurred in this economy. That means the remaining 90% of American families are struggling for table scraps. They're struggling to hang on to 4.7% of the income growth over that period. And get this, worldwide, the wealthiest 1,000 people in the world now have more resources than the poorest 2.5 billion people. 2.5 billion people. So the picture is clear. In America, fewer than 15,000 top dog families have doubled their income from 15 to 29 million. But 133 million other American families have seen their real income rise a paltry $400 from $33,300 to $33,700. For 90% of Americans, their income has been essentially frozen or worse. And because of that, those families have tried to sustain or raise their living standard by borrowing. And the amount that they borrowed to stay afloat is staggering. Now, everybody talks about how much the government has borrowed during the Bush presidency, and there is no question that it's been the most irresponsible administration fiscally in my lifetime. It's far worse than the fiscal recklessness of the Reagan era. But bad as that is, understand that mortgage debt has risen over that same period by $7 trillion. Now, all of that borrowing has temporarily sustained some families' living standards, but now the string is largely run out. And at the same time that this was happening, because previous Republican Congresses and the Bush and Reagan administrations, and I'm sorry to say at times the Clinton administration as well, collaborated on a binge of deregulation in Congress, often led by Phil Gramm, government regulators lost the ability to keep the big boys honest and rational, and Wall Street went on a binge. But the infection has now spread beyond Wall Street, far beyond even our own borders, and far beyond the banking system. The auto industry is now also in shambles and looking for a government bailout to save them, and you can bet your last buck that the airline industry is going to be right behind them. And who was the chairman of the committee, of the Senate Commerce Committee, when so much of this deregulation was being whooped through a misguided Congress? A fellow by the name of McCain. And the average middle-class family is now being squeezed from all sides. Flat income, more mortgage and college expense debt, rising health care costs, double energy costs, and now the raging instability of credit markets that threatens new and severe worldwide recession. Now, I know that there are those in the field of economics, and there are those who are running for president who will say, well, we can't do much about it. It's like the weather. We just have to get through it. We can't overcome the effects of globalization. Well, it's true. A significant amount of the squeeze is rooted in the reality of globalization. But government has done an awful lot to intensify that squeeze, and especially tax policy has hugely expanded that gap, and government is doing more and more each day to make matters worse. With one little example, I started with Ed Muskie about 1,000 years ago, what's known as LIHEAP, the Low-Income Heating Assistance Program. That's the program that makes small payments to low-income families and low-income elderly so that they don't have to choose between heating and eating. The administration this year, despite the fact that we have a 70% increase over a 2-year period in home heating costs, this administration is trying to cut that program by 22%. College costs are rising, and more people are trying to go to college because they can't get jobs. But the administration has resisted increases in the Pell Grant program to pay for those costs. And that program is today running a $6 billion shortage in meeting demand. Healthcare costs are rising, but the administration offers only the prospect of health savings accounts, which are of little or no use to American families who have no savings account and cannot afford to start one because they have no savings. There's a direct correlation between this grotesque maldistribution of income and the fact that 50 million Americans do not have health insurance. The administration and previous Congresses have provided $50 billion this year alone in tax cuts for millionaires, but they have resisted our efforts to provide $7 billion more for veterans' health care funding, and they resisted as extravagant our actions that provided an historic expansion of education benefits for veterans under the GI Bill. I'm proud that I pushed that through the Congress, through the House, even in the teeth of administration opposition. If the Congress had swallowed the president's budget, you need to understand in detail what that would mean. If we had swallowed the president's budget, we would have cut vocational education last year by 50%, and this year we would have abolished it. If we had followed the president's budget, we would last year have cut by 54% the program that teaches medical personnel how to deal with the specialized healthcare problems of kids in children's hospitals. And this year, we would have abolished that program. We would have cut rural health programs by 54% last year and 82% this year. We would have eliminated all student aid programs except Pell Grant and work study. Now, I've never had anybody in my life come up to me and say, Obie, why don't you wackos in Washington get your act together and cut cancer research? And yet that is precisely what the president did working with the prior Republican Congress. They tried to cut almost 1,000 research grants out of the budget for the National Institutes of Health. That means less research for cancer, for Alzheimer's, for Parkinson's, for Lou Gehrig's disease, you name it, across the board. And I don't think that's the way that America wants or should go. And all of those actions would have put an even tighter squeeze on the American middle class. And that's why, in my view, Americans need to disenthrall themselves of the myth of the 80s and 90s, the Ronald Reagan-driven myth that government is the enemy, and that if government would just stay the hell out of the way, that markets could deliver prosperity for all. Adam Smith, the high priest of capitalism, himself warned that if government was not strong enough and nimble enough to keep the big boys honest, then market forces would become so warped that capitalism would only work for the powerful and those with the largest rabbit's foot. The founding father of Wisconsin politics, old Bob La Follette, was not being a radical when he said the same thing. He was being a clear-eyed capitalist, a realist who understood human nature, power, and greed. La Follette understood those things. So did Henry Royce, Gaylord Nelson, Bill Proxmire, Clem Zablocki, and myself, all contemporaries of Bob Kastenmeier, and so does Bob himself. If he were in Congress today, Bob Kastenmeier would be casting vote after vote to change the outcome of those struggles. Now, some will say we're not talking economics, we're just talking class warfare. That's what those crazy left-wing pinko liberal Democrats always talk about, just class warfare. Well, Bob Kastenmeier understands that we've had class warfare over the last 30 years, and the middle class has lost, and we want a rematch. Between 1980 and 2006, 80% of the total national increase in income was garnered by the most well-off 10% of taxpayers. That's since the Reagan time. It got worse in the last 6 years. But the fact is people attack the Democrats or the progressives for being redistributionist, when in fact we've had the largest redistribution of income up the income scale in the modern history of the country. And now I know there are others who will simply say, well, you know, the principal problem is just the federal deficit, and if we just got that under control, that's about all the economy needs. And to them, I would simply say that budget policy or fiscal policy alone does not make economic policy. Far from it. Today's budget deficits are inexcusable, and so are the Bush policies that produce them. But budget balance sheets are not the only measure of economic wisdom or economic health. It's not enough that numbers simply add up in an accountant's ledger. Those numbers also need to demonstrate that they are being invested in the right things. Macroeconomic numbers can balance, and the nation can still have a screwed up imbalance in other things that really matter. The allocation of resources and benefits in an economy are just as important as the sides of the pie, and in fact that pie can become unnecessarily constricted if other factors are not in reasonable balance. If the economic elite of this country is the only group with enough financial resources to have a decent life and purchase the goods and services produced in an economy, our economy will still be a mess, as it has now become, and so will our society. Fairness and decency do matter. Prosperity for everyone matters a hell of a lot more, in my view, than prosperity for a few. If we don't all share adequately in the American dream, we will have a lousy, fragmented, crime-ridden, poverty-plagued society. Now, in evaluating debt, we need to distinguish between the year-to-year deficit and the long-term accumulation of unsustainable debt. And I want to just tell you a story to illustrate what I mean. Back when Jimmy Carter was president, Paul Volcker came to him and he said, Mr. President, we got a terrible problem. If you don't cut a lot of money out of your budget, the deficit's going to rise to $35 billion. So you got to do something about it. You need to cut about $13 billion. So we gathered in Bob Byrd's office for 3 weeks, went over every little item in the budget, cut a little bit here, a little bit there, and we wound up cutting $16 billion out of the president's budget request. We took it to both floors, passed it, President signed it, $16 billion in cuts, and guess what happened to the deficit? It didn't go down. It went up to almost $70 billion. Why? Because the economy went to hell. When the economy goes to hell, you don't have the revenue that you need to sustain the budget, and your deficit shoots up. So just being a green eye shade guy isn't going to get you there if the economy is sagging. What's important over time is not so much what the annual deficit is. What's important is whether the debt as a percentage of our total national income is going in the right direction or the wrong direction. And I am very tired of one-dimensional politicians who simply talk about the deficit when in fact we have a string of deficits that need to be attacked. We've got a budget deficit, yes. We've also got an education deficit, a science research deficit, an infrastructure deficit. This country has neglected for a long time so many of the basic investments that we need to make this country strong, and we need to change that. And we also have an equity deficit, a fairness deficit. I want to know that we're going to be attacking them all, not just the one that gets most of the press. The number that counts economically, as I said, is not the year-to-year deficit number. If you have the heart of a CPA, then maybe that's the only thing that matters to you. But if you're a public policy person trying to figure out how to strengthen this country long-term and how to strengthen the ability of this economy to produce for everybody in the economy, then you need to look at things in a much broader way. And equity is all important. The administration's recent Wall Street bailout package is an amazing example. In the short span of 2 weeks, under the most ideologically rigid administration in my lifetime, raw, unregulated free market, whatever the traffic will bear capitalism, produced such chaos in the economy that these self-styled defenders of capitalism have produced the greatest socialization of the economy in 2 generations. Yet at the same time, the administration has asked Congress to commit $700 billion to its credit market bailout. That same administration has prevented the passage of the entire discretionary portion of the budget, in plain language, the domestic appropriation bills, by insisting in the name of holy fiscal rectitude that Congress cut $14 billion out of crucial programs to help low and middle income people gain access to health care, to help middle income families send their kids to college, to help our communities clean up water and sewer systems, that help low income people pay their heating bills, that help medical research community to find ways to treat disease. And it just boggles my mind that the $700 billion cost of the Bush Wall Street bailout is 50 times as large as the cost of preserving those investments. Now, in today's politics, there's a lot of talk about ethics. I believe ethics in public service are absolutely crucial to strengthen our system of government. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't have made so many enemies in the Congress in years past by writing a new code of ethics for the Congress. But my old colleague, Otis Pike, made an observation during the Reagan years that rings as true today as it did when he said it. And here's what he said: "You can talk about ethics forever and pass more rules and reveal yourselves until all of your and your spouse's finances, food, drink, sex, religion, clothing, vacations, and the hours and minutes and places of your arising and retiring are all public records, but you will never be held in high regard or deemed ethical while you can't balance a budget unless a constitutional amendment makes you, while you accept gloriously optimistic economic projections rather than dealing with real ones, while you write a Graham-Rudman bill and then spend days finding ways around it, while you let one man make $550 million a year while thousands sleep in the streets." And I buy that. For all of his career, Bob Kastenmeier fought for and voted for policies that sought to remember that. So in honoring him and his service, we would not do justice to his legacy unless we remember that in addition to his persistent, insistent leadership on peace and civil rights, civil liberties, and intellectual property issues, his public service was also solidly centered in the Wisconsin progressive tradition of searching for economic justice, and in FDR's insistence that we break through government indifference so that we see the pain and the lost opportunities produced by that indifference. And that is where all of us need to be centered if we truly want to live up to the words that Americans so routinely recite with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Can you get this one? Thank you very much, Congressman. That was just wonderful, and this wonderful crowd has, I'm sure, been delighted. This I want to give you as the symbol of our law school. I know I can see the smile on your face. We call him the gargoyle, and it is inscribed Honorable David R. Obey, 2008 Robert Kastenmeier Lecture. That way, if you put it on eBay, we'll know. Okay.
Thank you very much.
The congressman is able to answer some questions. We've got, I think, about 15 minutes before our class comes into this room. But I've got to ask you something. Because we have overflow, please hold off on your question until the mic gets passed around. And do we have a mic passer somewhere? Could somebody, maybe get one of the ushers, Dave? I've got another one down here. I'll let the congressman call on you, Tony.
Congressman, here you are at the seat of one of the world's great universities. What role do you ascribe to the GI Bill and education as one of the driving forces in the last 50 years of this country?
Well, I think the GI Bill was transformational. I mean, it not only provided an entire generation with the ability to get a college education, but it also provided that same ability to people to get to buy their first homes. And it took an awful lot of people who otherwise would never thought of going to college, and put them through. I'm no economist, but I've seen numerous studies that have indicated that the GI Bill gave an economic return to the country of somewhere between 5 times as much as it cost and 8 times as much as it cost. I don't know which number is closer, but I'd say that's pretty impressive performance. And what I found so frustrating is that Senator Webb was the main sponsor of this in the in the Senate, and in the House, I was pushing it as chairman of the Appropriations Committee. And I had a problem with two groups of people. One were blue dog Democrats, some of whom could see the cost of everything and the value of nothing, and didn't want to see it passed. And then in the Senate, you had a number of people, including Senator McCain, who said that the bill was too generous to GIs, and that if we passed it, we wouldn't be able to keep people in the Army. To me, that's regarding them as indentured servants. And so we overcame it, and I think let me be blunt. I will vote for any opportunity to expand educational opportunity for anybody, anytime, anywhere. And I will vote for any opportunity to expand health care coverage to people anytime, anywhere. Those are the two things I just won't stop. Rick?
Congressman, I'm not completely sure of these numbers, but a lot of people are concerned that just hold on for a second. Certainly those of us that support Obama in the president's race, there's a lot of talk about if he wins, he's not going to have any money to do anything. But as I understand it, during the Reagan administration, the deficit was at about 6% of the gross national product. It's about 3% now. So is it possible that if he wins and you cut the tax breaks back that have been given to the wealthiest and you end those, that he could actually implement some of his health care proposals and environmental energy production proposals by increasing the deficit, and that we'd be all right financially if he did it?
Well, you can solve almost any problem by timing. And as far as I'm concerned, the very first thing that we're going to have to do after the election is to pass an economic recovery package, because this economy is in deep, deep trouble. And over a year ago, Nancy Pelosi convened a series of meetings in her office, in the Speaker's office. She had some of the best minds on Wall Street, some of the greatest economists in the country, a wide variety of people from the outside to offer advice. Barney Frank ran the meetings, and they made quite clear at the time that they thought that we were going to be seeing a significant and sustained recession, and that we needed to be prepared for it. So the first thing he's going to have to do is to do that. Second thing he's going to have to do is deal with the war. And the third thing he's going to have to do, in my view, he'll be dealing with the economic problem every blessed day. But the third item on his agenda that he has to move ahead on, in my view, is health care. Because I think Clinton, if he had moved earlier on health care, would probably have come up with a less complicated plan, because the Congress would have been more involved. When they put that together, I told Ira Magaziner, who put the package together, I said, Ira, I got a new rule. From now on, nobody with an IQ over 80 should be allowed to draft any legislation. Because you made this damn thing so complicated, nobody can understand it. But I think if Clinton had moved it earlier, he might have had a better chance of getting that done. But you can pass health care, but it will take a number of years to implement, and you can start carefully until you have a handle on the other problems. But you cannot just say, because we have economic problems, we have to put everything on hold. This society has too many problems to put them on hold. The one thing I would urge you to do is to ignore what both candidates say on taxes, because both candidates are talking so much about how they're going to cut people's taxes. And while I think that as part of an economic recovery package, you will have to have a short-term tax cut over the long haul, I think it's going to be very difficult for either candidate to cut taxes by the magnitude that either candidate is talking about. There's certainly Obama's package is a much more progressive package than McCain's, but I take with a grain of salt any candidate's promises on taxes. And frankly, if I had my way, we would have paid for the war cash on the barrelhead right from the start.
On the subject of taxes, it's my dim recollection that during the Eisenhower administration, the top bracket, I think if you earned over $300,000, you paid 90% in taxes.
Ronald Reagan never forgot that. He hated that.
Right. My question is, obviously you'd have to substitute a different number for 300,000, but do you think that that's at least a goal that we ought to be shooting for, or is it just so infeasible that we got to think otherwise?
No, I don't think you'll see anybody trying to impose tax rates at nearly that level, because the minute you do, you create a new industry. And that industry works night and day to build loopholes into the tax code, and so the 90% rate becomes meaningless. I would much rather have a more modest top rate and not have all of these blasted exemptions that make the tax code look like Swiss cheese. And I don't think going to a number that high would be sustainable. I just think if you can return the tax brackets on the top end to roughly what they were under Bill Clinton, that would be raising a significant amount of revenue. Obama's comes in about 10% lower than that, but I'm not going to quibble around the edges on that. But no, I think you have to have much more modest goals. But if you take a series of those goals, if you take a series of those steps to show that you're serious, I think every time that you get something done, it enhances your ability to do something else because you have a credibility as a person who can get things done.
It looks very good for the Democratic Party in the next election if we all work hard. But what are we going to do in the United States Supreme Court? I've got really no idea who's headed in the direction of and who is going to be a possible improvement in the people coming in to our United States Supreme Court.
How about Ann Bradley? Other than that, I have no ideas, but that would be my suggestion.
How are we going to pay for improving the infrastructure, which seems to me like the best way to put people back to work and get things going? And I don't see that this $700 billion leads that way. So do you have any suggestions for how that can work?
Well, the president didn't include anything like that in his package. But I was the sponsor of the Democrats' economic stimulus package that passed the House. And the major component, well over half the funding in that stimulus package, was for physical infrastructure. We wanted to greatly strengthen infrastructure, and by that I mean mass transit, highways, airport development, sewer and water, school construction, things like that. Then we wanted to provide a significant amount of money directly to state treasuries so that states, because of sagging revenues, don't wind up knocking kids off child health care rolls. And we wanted to enhance job training programs. We wanted to extend unemployment insurance. All of that is now gone because the situation is much more serious. In my view, we're going to have a package 2 to 3 times as large as the one that we put through the House, just for starters, in order to I mean, this economy is very large, and to have a significant impact, you've got to do some very big numbers. I think it will also contain a significant tax reduction, which will be temporary in nature, because this is meant to get the economy moving over the next 2 years. It's not meant to be permanent. And so I don't think that's going to be, I cannot imagine an economic recovery package that doesn't include a significant infrastructure portion.
Maybe one last question.
I mean, let me be frank about it. Nancy Pelosi is in contact with us every day. She and Barney and myself and 3 or 4 other members are putting together a recovery package, and we will have one ready to go as soon as the election is over.
Could some of these new jobs be in the green hat? I mean, global climate change is happening much faster than anyone had expected. And we desperately need to change our economy to a green economy. And it seems like if you're looking for places to put new jobs, it should be into turbines and solar and that sort of thing, so that we don't destroy the earth.
Well, I don't think there's any doubt about that, and you will not find anybody in the Congress more determined to do that than Nancy Pelosi. I mean, that's just right at the top of her priority list.
If we have a class coming here at 5:15, I think we better give us some time to get in. I did want to take a minute. The Congressman was good enough to acknowledge some of our many judicial luminaries, and I'm going to I'm sure not get them all, but I did want to identify 2 of Justice Bradley's colleagues on the Supreme Court who are also here. Justice Patrick Crooks. Pat. And also former Justice Louis Butler, who is now a member of our faculty. And I know there are a number of other members of the judiciary who are scattered around here who I've seen, but if I name all your names, you're going to delay people from the party that's outside. So anyway, our reception is outside, and I hope all of you will be able to join us. Thanks, Congressman.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.